gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the Geneva Press Club. Welcome online. I'm very glad to start the week with Geneva Solutions Media. Thank you, Geneva Solutions team. Thank you, Kasmira Jeffrey, for the interesting meeting that you are proposing to us today. The first session of the year has just started at the Human Rights Council with a freshly elected council president. The council faces many crises, starting with Ukraine and Gaza. This 6-week session will be crucial test for the council. That's of course, what we are also talking today here at the Geneva Press Club. Geneva Solutions Media, thank you for bringing us two great experts, which are guests today. Mark Lyman, you are Mark, the Executive Director of Universal Rights Group, and also thank you, Jeremy Smith, for being with us today. You are the Geneva Office Director of the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. And welcome today, Michel Langrand from Geneva Solutions team. Thank you for being part of the panel today. And thank you, Kasmira, for your presence today. And you are our moderator, so Kasmira, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll scrap the first part of my intro, which is introducing our great panelists. So we're here to talk about the next 6 weeks of human rights discussions taking place here in Geneva by the UN's top intergovernmental body tasked with promoting and protecting those rights, which one could argue has never been harder. We've already heard this morning from Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, and Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, both delivering some very stark words that really sought to highlight the difficult moment that we find ourselves in, and Turk talking in terms of, with words of natural disasters, seismic global shocks and fault lines between nations, so some very strong language there. Perhaps starting with you, Jeremy, what's your take from these opening speeches, and who else's words will you be paying attention to these coming weeks?
Thank you, and thank you to Geneva Solutions and the Geneva Press Club for hosting this. So I think foreign ministers or similar high-ranking officials from around 130 countries will be addressing the Human Rights Council in the next 3 days. I think for us, I see the issues of Ukraine and the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, especially Gaza, will likely be a central theme through many of these countries' interventions. Indeed, I believe these two situations will come to be a defining issue running throughout the council session. We will be paying close attention to how these situations are dealt with, both on their own merits and in comparison with each other, and by which states. In addition, for my organization, the Cairo Institute for Human Rights, based in the MENA region, we're also going to be paying close attention to how and if governments raise critical human rights situations within our region. Syria, Sudan, Yemen, Libya, and Iraq continue to be man-made catastrophes, humanitarian catastrophes, within which war crimes and atrocities are being committed on a regular basis. And often such crimes are normalized there. There are also situations throughout the region we work on in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Bahrain, and elsewhere, where governments have waged unrelenting crackdowns on dissent with widespread torture, imprisonment, forced disappearances, extrajudicial executions, and other forms of violent repression. Violations so prolific and brutal that they may, in some instances, constitute crimes against humanity as well, outside of conflict. And so for many civil society actors and citizens in the MENA region, central question will be how the global community and how these diplomats and how these foreign ministers will address these situations as well. Will they remain silent on these situations? Unfortunately, I expect that most of the situations I have highlighted will be largely or completely ignored in both the speeches of dignitaries and within the deliberations of the Human Rights Council. And that's something that maybe we can discuss a little bit later.
Thank you. Before we dive into some of those issues, Mark, a quick take as well on, I don't know if you had time, since you're traveling to get to this event, to tune into some of the speeches already this morning, but any takeaways? It's automatic. And you just
it's on?
Yeah.
Okay.
And do you think
I must admit I was a
excluded?
bad school child and didn't watch the speeches, but I can probably guess what they said because it's similar each year, and you gave a very quick introduction where you said they were warning about things have never been as bad and there's, the situation is pretty dire around the world, which is fine. Of course, it's their job, the Secretary General and the High Commissioner, to raise the alarm bells where things are going wrong. But I always think it's a little bit overdone. Every generation of diplomats who's, or in our case, civil society reps who have been through Geneva have always said that things have never been as bad as they are. And clearly there are big crises in the world. Jeremy mentioned a few of them, Gaza, Ukraine, etc. But I've been here since 2006, and there's always been these crises, and obviously the crisis in Gaza didn't just happen in October last year. It's been brewing for 50, 60 years. So what I would like to see, both, and again, I didn't hear the comments of the High Commissioner or the Secretary General, but I hope, especially the High Commissioner, because I think he gets this, in addition to the problems in the world, hopefully he will have also spoken about progress, because in many countries in the world they are making progress on human rights. We always, because it's human nature, tend to focus on the bad stuff and what's in the newspapers, or what you put in the newspapers. But there's a lot of progress in a majority of countries. But as I always say with human rights progress, it's quiet progress. It's a small change in legislation, training of police in how to interview people without torturing them, establishing national human rights institutions, is stuff that we don't notice unless it's brought to the Human Rights Council. So I hope, in terms of other high-level dignitaries, ministers, but I'm doubtful if they will come to the Human Rights Council to talk about their own national experiences, but areas where they've made progress, areas where they haven't made enough progress. But I expect what they'll do is what they always do, is talk about human rights in other countries. And then I'll stop there.
Thanks. And Michelle, just turning to you lastly for this first section, what are you watching out for the next few weeks? And you've reporting extensively on the Human Rights Council for 3 years for Geneva Solutions, so let's hear it from you.
Yeah, so I think that Jeremy and Mark covered pretty much, it's going to be a really long council. A lot of issues are on the agenda. So if I have to sort of pick one, which I think will be something I'll be looking at, especially this week, it's the tone and the political statements regarding Gaza. For me, it'll be a sort of it'll allow us to have a little bit of an idea of how political the discussions may get. As we know, there are several propositions on the table, which are, of course, as Mark said, I mean, they've been there since the beginning, some of them. Others are newer, but on the occupied Palestinian territories. So from my part, what will be interesting will be to see just how political the statements are, and so how political can the discussions when we need to negotiate these proposals can get, to the point of, will we get something meaningful voted at the end of the council?
And Mark, just quickly turning back to you, because you mentioned that you've heard a lot of this rhetoric over the years since you've been here since 2006. Do you think this? We've been talking a lot about the polarization of the Human Rights Council, this inability of council members to really get on the same page and reach consensus on issues. Is this overplayed?
Yes, it is. No, I mean, there are cycles, and clearly things are more polarized. Politicized, I'm always careful to use that word because the Human Rights Council is a political body, so it would be very strange if things weren't politicized. And human rights is a hugely political issue. So politicized, I would set aside, but in terms of polarization, I don't think things are significantly worse than they have been in the past, but we are on an upswing at the moment, and you know, we at the Universal Rights Group, we tend not just to make subjective assessments of these things. We look at things like number of voted texts, number of so-called hostile amendments that are tabled to texts. And last year, for example, even though everybody thought it was probably the most polarized year on record, there were fewer voted texts as a proportion of all text adopted than there had been for 7 or 8 years. So
how many are kind of voted on roughly out of all the texts? How many are
yeah, good question. It's somewhere around 20%. But there is absolutely polarization, especially as always on country-specific issues. And as Michelle said, we're going to see that coming out on the occupied Palestinian territories. It'll be also interesting to see whether the West is able to, listening to the statements today and tomorrow and the next day, the West is able to keep the coalition together against Russia, because there were some signs that that's been weakening in terms of those countries that are willing to take a stand on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the polarization, I think, can especially be seen as well on thematic issues. Basically anything these days to do with societal issues, private life, anything to do with gender, LGBTI, sexual and reproductive health rights, family, children. The two sides have been drifting apart. Also anything to do with religion, as we saw with the urgent debate about the Quran burnings last year. So I think one interesting thing to watch for over the coming weeks will be to see whether the new president of the Human Rights Council can do what he's prioritized, which is to try to create more space for dialogue, to bring countries together so they can have trying to understand each other's positions and maybe find some common ground if that's possible.
Thanks for that quick overview, and we'll be getting into some of those different issues later. But first, Jeremy, you were quoted in Michelle's piece this morning on our website on the kind of double standards at play, or that Israel's Western allies are being accused of at the Human Rights Council, and has been slow to condemn Israel over its actions in Gaza compared to its stance against Russia over Ukraine. What does this mean for the credibility of the Human Rights Council?
So first, I think I want to acknowledge what Mark said at the beginning, is that you know, it is easy for us to forget about all of the efforts that are done on the local level by actors constantly, often at great risk to themselves, to try to push through small victories. And I think that's important to recognize, to keep ourselves from falling into a pattern of cynicism that really is not helpful to anybody. But I also think maybe I disagree a little bit in the sense that I've also been following the council since its establishment, and I don't think I've ever seen an issue such as Gaza polarized so deeply in many ways. The political divides that already exist but are aggravated by various political choices. So, I mean, if the question is how will the debate on Gaza affect the council, I think that depends upon how will states approach the question. I mean, you'll have a debate on Ukraine, and only a couple days later a debate on Palestine, on the occupied territories, and on Gaza. Furthermore, you will have resolutions that will potentially be voted on both situations. So I think that the question will become very clear as to whether or not a principled approach, or at least something resembling a principled approach to international law, is put forward by countries on both situations, or if both situations continue to be treated with severe differences. And what I mean by that is, of course, most European countries and the US and other members of the Western group, the Western bloc of states at the United Nations, have left no stone uncovered when it comes to ensuring accountability and sanctions for Russia. Like, all out, every tool possible. And at the Council has put enormous effort into the creation of investigations on Ukraine and on Russia. But these same states have often refused to even recognize the atrocities being committed in Gaza, even as they're being broadcast on live news. Indeed, they continue to often provide unconditional or often unconditional support, the supplying of weapons, political support, aid to Israel, even as the International Court of Justice have said that this may likely amount to genocide. This is different, I think, than in the past. The debates on Palestine and on Israel at the Council have always been divisive, but we have a new element here, likely genocide, and genocide that is broadcast on social media and the news constantly for all to see. And you have positions by states, both at the Council and internationally, that are being compared inevitably between the approach and the position of the Western group on Ukraine and the approach on Gaza. These are all, I think, maybe nothing, it doesn't demonstrate something new per se, but it demonstrates a more intensification of the underlying divisions that have always plagued to the Human Rights Council. And I think it's coming to such a head to where it really does risk, I think as Mark hinted at, dividing and polarizing politics on multiple levels and on multiple issues, and undermining efforts at protection of situations around the world. Already, civil society organizations that work closely on Ukraine have spoken about and warned that the political support on Ukraine has begun to drift and weaken, and often the answers given for that have to do with the double standards demonstrated on Gaza.
Mark, I saw you nodding earlier. Did you want to react to Jeremy's point?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Jeremy said about the double standards between the way the West is responding on Gaza and the strength of its response on Ukraine. But going back to your question, I don't think that necessarily undermines the credibility of the Human Rights Council. I think it undermines the credibility of the Western group and diminishes their power and influence, which is happening anyway on a range of issues. They've been losing votes over the past 12 to 15 months on the Quran burnings, on the inability to continue with an accountability mechanism on Ethiopia, on China, on Yemen. So, and each time that they take these unjustifiable positions defending or refusing to criticize Israel, the problem is the West alienates countries within the OIC, for example, even moderate countries, which, as Jeremy said, that means that when the West needs those countries on a different issue, whether that be thematic or country-specific, they're not willing, because they say, well, you need us now, but you're not willing to say anything about what's going on in Gaza. So I think, yeah, it's not about the credibility of the Human Rights Council, it's about the power and influence of the Western group. What I do think is about the credibility of the Human Rights Council is I still don't understand why there hasn't been a special session or an urgent debate on what's going on in Gaza. I get it from the Western side. I don't really get it still, even though I've been asking OIC ambassadors why. But I think if the Human Rights Council is going to be credible and authoritative, there needs to be some kind of urgent debate or special session on what's going on in Gaza.
Thanks. Jeremy, do you agree as well that there should be a special session, and have you been following that?
I believe the Human Rights Council needs to strengthen in some way its approach to ensuring concrete accountability on the situation, whether that's done through a special session, whether that's done through urgent debate, or whether that's done, say, this session through the resolutions that are going to be proposed on Palestine, on the occupied territories. Any of those are options. And the critical point, I think, is to move this, in the Human Rights Council, to move this away from political posturing to a legal framework and to a documentation of evidence that can form the basis of factual assessments, legal assessments. The time has come to stop looking at what's happening in Gaza primarily through a political lens and more through a legal lens. And I hope that those countries who identify themselves as allies of Israel will begin to make that process occur this session, because otherwise, and I understand what Mark says. I think to those who regularly follow the Human Rights Council and the intricacies of the politics that play out at the Council, the legitimacy of the Council per se is not necessarily at stake in the very sort of nuanced perspectives that we approach it with. But I do agree that most people around the world and most civil society organizations around the world don't approach the Council that way. They look at it from a outcomes perspective and from a perspective of what's the quotes coming out of it, what's the states are saying, and whether or not outcomes that are furthering the goals that they see as legitimate human rights protections and needed human rights protections are coming out of the Council. And I think in that sense, the polarization of the Council caused by the situation or the double standards on Gaza could end up, in fact, undermining the credibility and legitimacy of the Council in people's minds in large parts of the world who are watching the Council and saying, so you have very strong investigations on Ukraine, you have very strong investigations on Russia, you have very strong investigations on Iran, you have very strong investigations on Syria, all these states that appear to be primary objectives of a very particular group of states and political alignment, but yet there's no investigation on Gaza, and yet there's a rejection by those same states on upholding the rule of law internationally on other very critical situations, with Gaza being in the primary visibility of everyone right now. So I think that does oftentimes, it could lead to a very destructive process for the Council. And I would say it's also contagious. So it's contagious in the sense that, like Mark says, the debates around religion, the debates around women's rights, the debates around LGBT issues, all are affected by that type of paradigm. And to be able to push those human rights protections forward on those will also depend on coming closer to a principled approach on situations like Gaza.
Thank you. And you touched on the Commission on Ukraine. If we could jump over to that topic, since we are going to quickly run out of time and lots to get through. Michelle, what kind of complications do you think might arise over the renewal of the mandates on the Commission on Ukraine, since that's up for renewal at this session?
Yeah, Mark already said, I mean, Ukraine, we've seen in other international fora, Ukraine has started to lose support. I mean, not only from sort of a unity from its Western allies, but we also see the Global South, which it has been trying to rally support from, especially through its this peace plan, right, that it has, that President Volodymyr Zelensky has proposed. They've been trying to rally support, and it's not easy, and we can already see that they are foreseeing that this is going to be an issue here at the Human Rights Council. At a press conference, the ambassador Yevgenia Filipenko last week, I think, I asked her precisely about sort of how worried they were about, how hard it would be to keep the support from the Global South. I mean, the resolution that created the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, it passed with pretty much a good vote count, let's say, in the first and the second time. Now, from a quick count, it seems like they should have the votes this time, unless it gets really political. I mean, there are some key Arab states there, like Qatar and Kuwait, I think, that are part of the council that up until now have, voted in favor of this. If there is a sort of, it becomes a bargaining chip if negotiations break down on the issue of Palestinian territories, would this affect the renewal of the Commission of Inquiry? I think that'll be interesting to see. I guess the key thing for Ukraine will be, can they keep these two things separate, basically?
For both of our guests, do you see a similar read across and a similar impact in what happens with this mandate?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, and as Jeremy said, there is this leaching effect, which does influence other initiatives, whether they be country-specific or thematic. I'll give two examples. One is Ukraine. I mean, I think the mandate will be renewed, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if the vote count goes down, and it's because OIC countries are annoyed, understandably, about these Western double standards on Ukraine as opposed to Gaza. And African states are increasingly annoyed about two things. One is the Western position on racism. Certain Western states every year call a vote, and some of them vote against, which is incredible. If you think about the importance of the issue of racism, then it's something we should all be able to agree that we need to all work together to eradicate racism. But, and it goes back to Jeremy's point about leaching between issues, the issue on racism is because Israel doesn't like the African racism resolution, because it mentions something called the Durban Declaration, a Program of Action, which Israel claims is an anti-Semitic document, which is complete nonsense. But unfortunately, if Israel picks up the phone to Germany or the US or other countries and said, we don't like this resolution, we want you to vote against it, the West does. And that's what happened at the September session, because obviously, the Africans were trying to get consensus and made a lot of concessions. But then October 7th happened, and Israel just said to the Western countries, you will not vote in favor of this, you will call a vote, and they all did so. So losing OIC support, including moderate OIC supports, because of the Gaza situation, losing African support, including moderate African support, as well, because of the racism and also for example, the approach last year, the Western approach to calling a special session on Sudan when there was no African support. That will feed in. So when Western countries come and say, look, we want you to vote in favor of the renewal of the mandate of the COI, I think these days many countries will think twice. And my last point is we have to remember over the past 5 or 6 years, we've moved from a unipolar world, especially on human rights, especially in the Human Rights Council, where usually in the past, especially during the Obama administration, if the US wanted something, they could get it through and they could knock heads together. Whereas now it's bipolar. China is equally, if not more, influential and powerful at the Council now. And so if you're a moderate African state or a moderate OIC state, you now have a choice. You don't have to go with the US just because they tell them to and remind you that they are your key political and economic partner. You can also go the other way. So I think Michelle is right. It'll be interesting to watch the vote count, and I suspect it might go down.
And then trying to work backwards through some of the issues that we've mentioned earlier. So this topic, one topic that's increasingly causing heated debate and pushback among certain states is on gender-related rights. And there's been a proposal announced by Finland and other countries, including Australia, South Africa, on a resolution on the rights of trans people. That I think there'll be first negotiations next week. Informal negotiations. How do you foresee these discussions playing out at the council? Mark, starting with you.
Yeah, I think the Finns are very brave, is what I think. Now, I was surprised to see that. I mean, as I mentioned before, it's very difficult at the moment in terms of polarization on anything to do with society and culture, family, LGBTI rights, gender. And this issue of trans rights is undoubtedly important, as are in many, but it's also incredibly complex. I mean, even in liberal Western democracies, there's huge debates on this issue. I mean, not so long ago, the First Minister of Scotland in the UK basically, well, it was part of the reason she had to resign on this issue, and you will have seen the kind of backlash against J.K. Rowling, including at some point they were talking about taking her name off the Harry Potter book. And that's in Western liberal democracies with fairly progressive societies. So to bring that into the Human Rights Council in the current climate is an interesting discussion, especially because Finland is a new member of the council. It's never good to make predictions, but that's one to watch that maybe could be the first thematic resolution in the council's history to be rejected. If you think about the number of African states that would vote for it, the number of OIC states that would vote for it, and even conservative Christian countries like Georgia, Ukraine, it will be a tough one, but maybe I've misread the room, but I think it'll be difficult.
Yeah, I wanted to add something to that just because, indeed, I mean, we've seen this discussion sort of coming up also in other UN agencies, causing a lot of controversy, even the WHO recently trying to put together guidelines on the issue of trans healthcare, and it's definitely proving to be difficult, even within, as Mark said, the progressive liberal democracies. So I think if they do manage to get this resolution approved, it would at least provide some clarity in a lot of these issues, because I think that because there's so much controversy, there's a lot of difficulty even from civil society to see how they should position themselves on this complex issue. So yeah, I think that it will be definitely one that we will be watching closely.
At the same time, I mean, do you agree that perhaps it's a good thing that countries even if a resolution doesn't have hopes of passing, it needs to be brought to the table? There has in the past been a kind of a fear of losing face and of bringing a resolution and seeing it not passed and therefore not bringing it at all. So it's a good step in the right direction.
For the issue, although I mean it could be dealt with elsewhere, for example, on the Soju resolutions in that context. But anyway, you're right, for the issue, like many issues, it is important. and there are serious human rights violations against trans people around the world. So on its merits, yes, maybe you're right. But I think you always have to balance that with the wider work of the Human Rights Council. And in addition to the hypocrisy we've already spoken about in terms of how the West deals with different country situations differently, there's also a lot of anger, especially in the African group and the OIC, at this tendency at the Human Rights Council of Western states to keep pushing very progressive. I mean, we may agree with them, but from the viewpoint of Muslim majority countries and various African countries, these are very difficult issues. Pushing all of these progressive ideas, whether it's in existing resolutions with strong wording or strong language, or in this case, a wider resolution, which, in my view, that it will just fuel the kind of polarization we're talking about. This feeling in the African and OIC groups that the West isn't listening to them, and the West only talks to them when they want something. And at the same time, they keep pushing every session more and more of what are very sensitive and difficult issues. What was interesting was when there was the urgent debate on the Quran burnings, because there the OIC wanted to talk about that, and the Western countries affected by it, including Sweden and a few others, didn't want to talk about it because they felt uncomfortable, and they knew back home it was a sensitive issue. And so I remember saying to the Swedish ambassador at lunch the other day, I said, at the kind of uncomfortable position you found yourself in last year, that's what OIC countries and African countries often feel themselves in, that if they express concerns about something like this new resolution, the finger is pointed at them as bad countries that are against human rights. But actually, these are just very sensitive topics. So I agree with you on its merits. It undoubtedly merits, it deserves to be discussed at the Human Rights Council. But I just wonder about the greater damage it could do in terms of polarization.
Jeremy, on just picking up on that point on the burning of the Quran and the slated discussions at this session on the issue of religious hatred, and there'll be reports presented. Can you just tell us a little bit more about this issue and its significance for OIC states who are leading it?
Sure. So I think it's important to recognize that there is a resolution this session, 1618. It's a resolution that was created some years ago on, quote, combating intolerance, negative stereotyping and stigmatization of and discrimination, incitement to violence, and violence against persons based on religion or belief. That resolution, which will come up this session, has been adopted by the Council for several years on a consensual basis. No vote because everyone agrees it should pass. That resolution came out of a negotiation process between various groups of states at the Human Rights Council in response to a former initiative of the OIC called defamation of religions. And many organizations and states and diplomats worked very long time to come to an understanding, a consensual approach that these issues are serious, issues of religious hate, of religious discrimination, are serious and need to be condemned, but you cannot and you should not attempt to insert into the international legal framework, and dare I would say also the national legal framework, prohibitions or try to criminalize religious offense. And because as soon as you criminalize religious offense, it becomes a subjective process as to whom is offended, by what, and for what. And when you do that, it does and is constantly used in some countries, many of the countries in the OIC, use defamation laws to imprison political opponents, to imprison human rights activists, women's rights activists, LGBTQ activists, and sometimes just anyone who opposes the state, and the state says that they are the arbitrator of religion and appropriate interpretations of religion. So, and by the way, the vast majority of those affected by such laws and oppressed by such laws are Muslims. So I really think that, you know, the 1618 resolution is the way to go forward. It's a strong attempt to prevent the types of hate-driven crimes that rise to violence or incitement to violence, or discrimination, state-sanctioned discrimination especially. So you have an answer already at the Council. The resolution is there. The debate last year on religious hatred once again attempted to insert, and even more clearly this time, encourage states to adopt laws to outlaw religious offense as violence, as a form of violence. So if you desecrate a religious symbol publicly, that is considered, that should be classified in law as an act of violence that someone can be criminally punished for. I don't think I have to explain too much as to how dangerous that is to very basic principles of freedom of expression and other forms of civil and political rights. So I believe it is really important that we make the potential consequences of this approach clear to many moderate OIC members who maybe maybe were led toward this outcome at that session out of a feeling of pressure to be seen doing something about the burning of the Quran. And I understand that. And by the way, fully, we always and will always condemn fully the burning or the desecration of holy symbols. It's always wrong. It never really helps anything, and it really is, it undermines the dignity of people. But having said that, the current approach of religious hatred and the approach I just described, in the context of, say, Europe, where you have the rise of neo-fascist, xenophobic, Islamophobic Christian parties within national politics, this approach literally gives them a tool to outlaw mosques, to outlaw religious practices of Muslims as a threat to society. And this is their terms. They use it all the time. Threat to society and stability, and as an act of some form of violence against Christianity, to allow for the free practice of that religion within their societies. If you don't believe me, look at the rhetoric of Hungary and other countries. So inadvertently, the OIC is giving a tool for the oppression of Muslims in non-Muslim majority countries. That is very important, I think, for moderate OIC member states to understand, and for Muslims around the world to understand, and whether or not they actually want to go through with that. There is already, like I said, a resolution that is at the Council attempting to protect the rights of religious holders, and I think that should be the way we move forward.
Thank you. I mean, both of you have given us, we're running out of time soon, so I'm going to quickly, if I have time, Mark, I know you've got to get away soon. Do I have time for 2 more questions?
Yeah,
yes. But, I mean, we will have to go. You've both given us, highlighted the complexities going into this council behind some of these discussions, resolutions taking place. The task of the Human Rights Council President, the Moroccan ambassador Omar Zniber, who took over at the beginning of this year, is quite a delicate one, because ultimately it's to try and get countries to agree, get work done, and ensure that there are some positive, tangible outcomes at the end of the 6-week sessions. How important is the role of the president in doing that? I mean, it's, I think, traditionally seen as the person who chairs these debates, but it's much more than that. And if you could give us your view.
Yeah, it's limited. I mean, it has evolved, the role of the president. Before, up until about 7-8 years ago, it was essentially just to chair the Human Rights Council. But then an office of the president was established, and different presidents, when they became president, started publishing what their priorities would be during the course of their term. So it has evolved, but still they are the servant of the member states of the Human Rights Council, so there are limits to what they can do. But one area where they can make a difference, and as you said, this president really wants to try to do that, is in bringing states together to try to make sure that global geopolitics doesn't buffet the Human Rights Council to too great a degree, and that we can, where possible, come together to maintain the current agreement between states, or the current consensus. And a good example of that is what Jeremy just spoke about, the twin resolutions at this session, one on freedom of religion and belief, which is by the European Union, and the other one is 1618, so the resolution on combating religious intolerance, which is led by the OIC. These resolutions have different approaches. Of course, one focuses on the enjoyment of the freedom of religion. The other focuses on attacks against, or discrimination against people on the basis of religion. And these two resolutions have always existed in balance.
You speak a little bit into the microphone.
Sorry, yeah, these resolutions have existed in balance. It's a bit weird, really, because the OIC isn't really allowed to change the resolution on religious intolerance, and the EU isn't allowed to change theirs. And if they even add a few words, then they have to inform the other side, and the other side is allowed to add a few words. I mean, this is where it is, but it's an important balance. And the president of the Human Rights Council is really keen to make sure that balance is maintained and the consensus is maintained, especially because of what happened last year in terms of the urgent debate on the Quran burnings. And so he has already organised one roundtable discussion with key members of the EU, key Western states, and with key OIC member states. Towards the end of next week, there will be a second roundtable. Very informal, just bringing the key players together to try and maintain this consensus. And I think it is possible. I mean, Jeremy mentioned the Resolution 1618. That contains an action plan of steps that governments have to take to combat religious hatred and intolerance. And we've analysed it over the years, and the vast majority of the points in that action plan have been implemented and have led to real changes on the ground in countries around the world. The problem is that one part of the action plan that says states shall prohibit incitement to hatred. And the issue there is that paragraph on the incitement to religious hatred and discrimination, it's based on US constitutional law, which is a very high threshold in terms of protecting freedom of expression, which is the US constitutional provision, or constitutional law says states shall prohibit incitement to only prohibit incitement to imminent violence, meaning if Trump stood up and said, I want my followers to go and kill Muslims, that's not okay, and that can be prohibited. Anything else goes. And the problem is that is inconsistent with what is in the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is states shall prohibit incitement to discrimination, hatred, and violence. Which, in my view, burning of a Quran during Ramadan outside a mosque is incitement to religious hatred and discrimination. But anyway, that action plan has been working. So the goal of the president, I think, will be to try to isolate that one part of the action plan, try and get the two sides to discuss that part, and then hopefully the rest of the 1618 resolution and the rest of the freedom of religion resolution will remain in balance, because the risk at this session is the OIC will add lots of new wording about burning of Quran and incitement to hatred, and that will destabilize this relationship between the two resolutions, and then it will be a big fight in the Human Rights Council on this extremely emotional issue.
We interviewed him just ahead of the council, and he said one of his strategies would be to try and meet with countries and get them to discuss ahead of the session. So hopefully that happened, and we'll see what the results are in the next 6 weeks. And I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. We did want to touch on briefly the issue of money at the Human Rights Council, since there's been it's been well trailed, the UN's liquidity crisis, which is also now having an impact on the Human Rights Council, which hasn't been able to offer full online participation this session, which is impacting those states who don't have representation here and civil society groups. Maybe just a quick minute before we leave. Jeremy, your organization signed a letter regarding the impact of this. Yeah, tell us why this is bad news.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think we have to recognize that the human rights pillar of the United Nations has always been deeply underfunded. It's what, 2% of the budget, 3% of the so it's already chronically underfunded. And currently now with what they were calling the liquidity crisis of the United Nations, because states are not paying their dues. I don't know if it's the same in every aspect of UN work, but it's certainly beginning to undermine the very foundational capacities of the human rights system here. Hiring freezes for investigations into ongoing atrocities are being hirings are being put on hold. Investigations are being hampered. The ability of civil society or from around the world is being cut off their ability to access meetings, to access online meetings is being cut off. And on top of that, you also have an increased security sort of protocol within the United Nations in Geneva that is also chipping away at civil society access. So it's a really critical issue, and one that I think, again, requires states to demonstrate some political will to maintaining the international system of human rights. And if could I, since this will probably be my last intervention, maybe if I could just make a one minute closing statement. We talked a lot today about double standards, about how this could affect different things at the Human Rights Council. There's one type of actor at the UN that benefits the most from this. And those are those actors that both on the national level and on the international level view human rights as a strategic threat to their own governmental power. Usually very autocratic countries who view the international human rights system and as that's an extension of their own national approach to human rights, which is eradicate those who work on human rights, imprison them, torture them, get rid of them, outlaw human rights organizations, et cetera, et cetera. And they also act on the international level to try to demolish the international human rights system in many different ways. Those are the primary benefactors of the polarization of the council, of the potential inability of the council to come to strong human rights conclusions and outcomes, and these types of outcomes. So, there needs to be a larger strategic undertaking and thought process by states at the council as to what kind of future we are headed toward on the international human rights system if they continue to pursue double standards that are going to continue to paralyze or increasingly divide the Council. Thank you.
Mark, I'll let you close.
Very quickly, yeah. No. I always find it quite amusing when states complaining about this is going to be a 6-week session, maybe even slightly more, and B, complaining that the escalators aren't working and the lights aren't on and there's no money for the Human Rights Council to continue its work, because it's the fault of the states themselves. The problem is there are so many resolutions creating so many mandates to write reports, to set up different mechanisms, that the costs of the Human Rights Council are spiraling almost out of control. Last year, for the first time, the budgetary implications of resolutions adopted by the Human Rights Council touched $100 million US. That was a 40 million jump on the year before, and 10 years ago it was something like 20 million US. That's a lot of money, and so of course it's going to be very difficult to service that. As Jeremy said, the Human Rights Council, the human rights pillar has always been traditionally underfunded, around 3.5% of the UN's regular budget. So that's it's difficult, but it explains why there is these budgetary squeeze. That, in addition to the fact some dues haven't been paid, but it also explains why we're having 6 weeks and maybe 6.5 week sessions. The other point on money, by the way, is what it's being used for. A lot of that money, that 100 million I talked about, is a lot of it is important, going to service COIs, but a lot of it is operational costs on the part of the Secretariat and the OHCHR, rather than being used to actually improve human rights on the ground through the delivery of technical assistance or capacity building, for example. And I won't have a closing statement because I think it was a super good discussion and I think we covered all the key points.
Thank you very much. We did indeed cover a lot of ground, and Michelle, I wanted to turn to you, but we've did you have some? Did you want to? I know you're looking into this issue of financial constraints and how this is impacting the council, and Mark there mentioned that money actually impacting mandates on the ground, and we are seeing this, for example, with the new Commission of Inquiry on Sudan, for example. Perhaps you want to touch upon that before we this time really sign off.
Yeah, just to quickly sum up. Yeah, so we will be looking at this issue a little bit more to understand a little bit what is the impact of not only the current liquidity crisis, but of course one that goes beyond that, and the sort of the underfunding of the human rights pillar, and how this is affecting actually some of the work of these mechanisms, but also this is the Commission of Inquiries, the independent expert on Sudan, which has been trying to get a team off the ground because of the resolution that was adopted in September, but that because of the hiring freeze, apparently they haven't been able to do that. So there are a lot of moving parts there. There are also special procedures and other treaty bodies and others that will be also reporting on and how this is affecting them and their ability to work, because also as the the crisis extends over time, we also have staff that are tired. The UN has to sort of try to work around trying to sort of build it like a puzzle, see how they can work around the hiring freeze and the budget issues. So it's definitely something that sort of just worsens over time. So yeah, just we'll be looking at that in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much. Thanks to our audience online for being tuning in today, and we'll be back next month with another discussion. And we will please keep your eye out on the Geneva Press Club page for the dates for that and the topic. And thank you very much, Jeremy, Mark, for being with us today. And I imagine you'll be heading back off to the Pelle to follow the work there. So goodbye. Bye, everybody. Thank you. Apologies, we normally have questions, but I didn't leave very much time. But we can. Do you both have time for questions? Yes. Let's take a question. We have time, Isabella. We're freestyling.
Is this one working?
From what I could understand, I'm going to ask 3 simple questions. First, one of you said people have to understand, we have to make people understand, etc. What do we do with the increasing number of people who don't understand what we think they should understand? Because people, even in Latin America, they vote for fascists, although they just experience fascism. In North America, they want to vote for Trump. In Russia, after the downfall of the one-party rule, they vote for Putin. In the MENA region, even in Gaza, they support jihad with regressive ideas. So what are we going to do with these people who should know and we want them to know and understand, but they don't? My second question, lately at the press briefing at the, I hope I am not infringing on embargoes and of the record, the Swiss ambassador admitted that there is nothing the UN can do if people on the ground don't want to live in peace together. And we can put it another way, that is, if people want to live together peacefully, we don't need the UN. So is the UN about to collapse the same way as the League of Nations was? And my third question, do you think that a man like Salman Rushdie, if he was not reached by age limit, would make a good High Commissioner for Human Rights?
Who wants to answer? Maybe start with the last question. What about Salman Rushdie?
Yeah, Jeremy, would you like to comment?
Hello? Yeah. I, as a person, I think Salman Rushdie would be pretty good as, but I don't think he would ever be accepted, right? Especially given that people like Iran have issued fatwas for his death. So it's an interesting thought, but one that I could never see happening. Should I address any of the other questions?
It gives us some